excited to sort of walk through this, and we have been working, Christina reminded me today, for 3 years on this broad campaign to prove that we can finance the reduction of gender-based violence. And the campaign has evolved over time. When we really started, we were just trying to come up with any ideas, right? So we were really proud to come up with about 75 ideas of ways that you could finance the reduction of gender-based violence. But over the last couple months, we've stepped back and really synthesized what have we learned. And so what I want to do in this presentation is give you a little bit of a window into the roadmap that we're seeing of the next couple years of work to finance the reduction of gender-based violence. And so it's just been amazing to have all of this collective energy coming together in imagining what is possible. I've learned so much and changed my mind about so many things, even in the first week. But wanted to give you this lens for 2 reasons. And I'll get to just reminding you to drop into the chat any questions or comments, anything you think would reinforce a point that we're making, and we'll keep coming back to this. So I want to walk through a synthesis of our research over the past 3 years, think about what this roadmap for finance looks like, and also just to be honest about what Criterion's priorities are. One of the pieces of Convergence that how we hosted Convergence, especially when we were building the field of gender lens investing, is this isn't about what Criterion does. This is about what the 81 people engaged in all of the organizations behind them do, and what we do collectively and how we collaborate. But I've found within that it's useful for Criterion to name our priorities, because we all end up being very polite, like, oh, well, maybe you want to do that, maybe we want to do that. And so sort of saying, here are the pieces that we're committed to moving forward, which also lets you say, hey, that thing really, really needs to move forward, and I want to take the leadership on it. Because really believe this is a roadmap for a field moving things forward and what's needed to advance financing the reduction of gender-based violence. So throughout this, you know, it's funny, I actually hadn't planned on doing the acknowledgement, and I'm sitting here missing it, because it's been so much of our conversations, and I'm starting to talk about gender-based violence, and I've just gotten into the practice of remembering to acknowledge this issue. So if I'll maybe just pause here for a second and ask you to do this with me. So hands off your keyboard for a second, and you don't have to come on video, we can just do this alone, and take hold of your own hand. This is not a light topic, and in this conversation, we will intellectualize and abstract a set of very real experiences. These discussions may trigger a wide range of emotions. In this room, statistically, are many, many survivors of gender-based violence, and we all participate in the political, social, cultural, and economic systems that give permission for and facilitate violence. A moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this precise moment, somewhere, to someone. Now reverse your hands. Notice the difference as you change from one perspective to another, discomfort, but also a little bit of openness. We've come together to create new possibilities to address the epidemic of violence in our world, and connected in new ways, we can do even more. Let us begin. So I was getting into this ritual of doing this all the time. It's really kind of amazing to feel that absence after this week. So we're going to walk through 5 strategies and then go into some other details. And again, this is the roadmap that we've been sort of researching for the last 3 years. And so first of all, 5 strategies. The first one is to invest in companies making a difference in gender-based violence. And over the last couple of years, we've collected well over 30, 40 companies that are intentionally designed to be able to address gender-based violence. Fight Back started out of Nepal and then scaling more broadly. C-Note out of California, which is an amazing organization working on different approaches to financial services. And Level Forward, one of our heroes in this work, is a media company out of New York working on shifting gender norms in how films are made. So one thing is to say, within this invest in companies, we're either looking for companies that have a current intent to address this. The second is thinking about companies that could be shaped or benefited by investment to move them in the direction or to scale their work. So for example, advertising firms. Can we shape advertising firms to create a arm of their business that does better on gender? And how could we finance more advertising firms to do that? This moving company example came out of the impact investing conversation, and we've got an example of a moving company that's looking at survivors of gender-based violence and how to get them moved out of their homes. The third category is about sort of really spurring innovation. I think when people say, well, why aren't there more innovative companies addressing gender-based violence? Well, part of that is because we don't have an ecosystem of innovation that's supporting those kinds of development. So just a set of areas where imagine a set of accelerators or investment funds that are focused on anything from fintech to neuroplasticity to, I would love if somebody just addressed home security systems, and can we build home security systems that are less conducive to stalking? I don't know if that's possible, but that's why we have innovation. So we're going to come back to thinking about companies on Monday, in Monday's context session, and continue to go deeper into how do we invest in companies that through their actions could make a difference on this. But that's just one of 5 strategies. So the second one is looking at benchmarks that assess company practices. And these are largely, we've been focused on looking at these in public equities, but also the sort of publicly traded companies, large corporations, multinational corporations, thinking about those benchmarks, but also thinking about how do we do that for companies that are small and medium enterprises, small businesses, wherever they are. It can be across the spectrum. How do we know whether or not the company practices are contributing to gender-based violence reduction, both in their own workplace and in the world through their workplace practices? So the third strategy then, and we had a magical, yummy conversation about this morning, is about integrating the analysis of gender-based violence into how we assess market risk. So in the first 2 strategies, we're really looking at what's happening inside of companies and what companies are doing. In the third one, we're focused on that gender-based violence happens in the world. 1 in 3 women experience gender-based violence. That is material. So like climate, how do we really establish the materiality of gender-based violence as a market, systemic, chronic, however you want to describe it, risk, but really looking at the risks that gender-based violence presents in the world and how investors should appropriately value that. Last night, I was able to film this magical conversation. I so enjoyed this conversation with Daniela and Gita on why the future matters in finance. And I commend that conversation. It was posted this morning, but again, exploring why it's so important to see what's happening in the world, to understand the shifts and patterns that are driven by gender-based violence, that are driving increases or reductions in gender-based violence, and how do we really understand that? So fourth is to look at process metrics in looking at how we evaluate investment managers. And so a lot of this work has come out of our work with government, saying as blended finance money is going out, as whether it's the Canadian government or the Australian government or the US government is putting money to investment managers and saying, do good things on gender equality, we don't have enough process metrics that say, how would we know they're doing a good job, right? Are they doing a gender analysis in context? Thinking about the conversation that I heard about this morning, looking at what is the stakeholder engagement that happens in investment processes around infrastructure? Are you engaging the community effectively? That could be a process metric that says, we're not going to invest in you if you're not, or if you don't, we're going to charge you higher fees, or blah, 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 all the kind of incentives that we have within finance. And then finally, structuring requirements. And this is building on the fourth one. The sort of process metrics is one way to sort of nudge people to do something. This fifth one is saying, how do we bake it into the terms of the financial transactions? For example, looking at housing, and how would we finance housing developments in such a way that they were more appropriate for survivors of gender-based violence and domestic violence in particular. So across these 5 strategies, what we've been working on over the last couple of years is thinking about what are the methodologies and tools that support those strategies. I mean, not lost on anybody in this conference, but Criterion is a think tank. And I've actually been reveling in, as we ended this conversation last night, I thought, I get to spend my days having these kinds of conversations. What amazing privilege. But one of the things that we do with these conversations and say, how do we put these together to create methodologies? And so, for example, we're going to be publishing a white paper on how to value norms change in market risk. We've been looking a lot, and that was in the conversation this morning, about correlations between political risk and gender-based violence. We've published this due diligence guide, which has been adapted to multiple settings, and hopefully in a couple days we'll have one coming out, thanks to Vicky and Julia, specifically looking at Australia. We're about to, and this is we're about to embark in a year, 2, 3 commitment to really looking at infrastructure investments and thinking about what are the indicators. So at some level, it goes from, here is the strategy, but how can we support the implementation of that strategy? But that's not enough. Because in some ways, those are very broad and general. And what I've learned, been reinforced by these conversations, is we also need to look at a variety of different lenses. It's not just okay to say, we're looking at risk and the materiality of gender-based violence, or I'm looking for companies. We then have to slice it in a couple different ways. And so I want to just walk through these quickly. Walk through these for the rest of the time, actually. So the first is thinking about a sectoral lens on gender-based violence, and I want to thank the people who were in the sector conversation. Just delightful in terms of really thinking through, how do we get specific about gender-based violence in a sector? Because that's a place that finance can really make a difference. And the sort of question of, is there a lead organization, is there a lead company within that sector that can facilitate, as, who was saying this, at the sort of race to the top, Allison, I think Allison Pyatt was really pushing the, how do we facilitate a race to the top within a sector? But also, how do we look at the systemic risks and the sort of the ways in which agriculture as a as a sector has so many reasons why it ends up being the highest incidence of gender-based violence. But also saying we need to look at the informal sector, a somewhat different slice, because there is so much exposure to gender-based violence in the informal sector, and how do we understand that in particular? So imagine kind of roadmaps based on these individual sectors and white papers, that kind of stuff. We're a think tank, get to put these things together, but how do we think at a sectoral level? Second thing is, how do we think by asset class, right? As we move into the design section, we're now fully in the design sessions in Convergence. And so part of that is causing us to be more specific. What kind of money are we talking about? But because the difference between private debt going to a small business in Vietnam is very different than holding a public equity in, stock in Amazon, right? Those are very different kinds of financing. So how can we look by asset class? And so at the end of Convergence, we're having a conversation on a roadmap in public equities, and we're starting to hear some really interesting momentum around different strategies in public equities, that if we got a bunch of investment firms together, we kind of know what we can do, and there's data there that will help us implement it. Another angle is to look at this geographically. These are the geographies that where you end up living. I mean, I live in Connecticut. Randomly, it was halfway between Boston and New York when I wanted to move back here from Milwaukee. How Criterion ended up working in these 5 particular geographies, I'm not exactly sure, but I love these. There's sort of such a deep commitment to working in these geographies and going deep and really understanding how do we connect opportunities and civil society, because it's in those human settings where we actually have the organizations that have the knowledge, and organizations work geographically, right? The sort of collection of organizations working in Australia is differently meaningful than a broad conversation. And I love how the different geographies in this global conference are weaving together. And I'm so appreciative of our sort of, maybe cabal is not the right word, but I'll go with cabal from Kenya, of these amazing grassroots organizations who are going to wield significant power coming out of this conference. And then just a flag, we're actually looking at, we have a deep commitment to working in Southeast Asia for now about 6 or 7 years. And part of that is a new project looking at waste pickers and sort of the experience of waste pickers in the solid waste management world. And so again, that gets really specific. I think what's been fruitful as we go through these conversations is to move from abstractions of gender-based violence to more and more specificity. And the next type of specificity is looking at the different types of gender-based violence. The difference between understanding domestic violence and listening to Karen talk this morning about trafficking, or looking at sexual exploitation in supply chains, or this sort of emerging explosion of online gender-based violence, and seeing those as focal areas in their own right, and how do we organize around those lenses. And then finally, who are the specific actors? How do we enable pension funds or superannuation funds to use their power? How do we enable donor governments to use their power? And again, this is a cross-section. Donor government, the Global Affairs Canada might be working in a particular geography, have a particular slice of gender-based violence that they have partners that are working with, and they have blended finance, which is probably not going to be public equities. So again, thinking about how this is a kaleidoscope. And I remember you all meeting Todd on one of these earlier calls, our tech guy, but he's trying to imagine how do we bring this kaleidoscope alive on the internet in a website, and hopefully coming out of Convergence. That's sort of our plan, is in October we'll be able to pull this together. A couple more comments though. One is, out of this, we've actually prioritized a set of focus demonstrations that we're personally wanting to get involved in. A lot of our work as a think tank is to really put out the white papers and the research and the sort of what's possible. And then we lean in from time to time and focus on a specific idea. So we will be focusing on infrastructure for the next couple of years with DFIs and others, because of how much money is moving as a result of COVID around infrastructure. There's just an opportune moment to focus on that, and in partnership with UNICEF, who's just been an amazing partner in our work and a sponsor of Convergence. My personal obsession, if Chris Anderson is listening, he shares this with me, is how do we look at student debt in the United States and think about different ways to finance student debt. So I always want to make a plug for that personal passion that we will work on at some point. Just wanting to make sure we leave some time for questions. This is where we started our campaign, right? We said we'd aggregate $1 trillion of intent. This is before we had any ideas. We just said we're going to get $1 trillion of intent and say that there's these investors who would move their capital, who if there were products, if there was a way to invest to make a difference on gender-based violence, they would move money in this direction. Of course, there was nothing in particular to commit to. And we got to $1 trillion. I mean, formally, I think we got to 750 billion. But we really then got lured into this question of how do we move from intent to action? Because more people will commit. More people will commit because of your ideas this month. They are stunning ideas. And the conversations that you're having will attract more people to take action. But it also matters to us deeply that this isn't just about finance. We need to have, our goal was 100, I hope it's more than that, of gender-based violence organizations who are equipped to work on this. And we had a goal of $10 billion. I think we'll move past that pretty quickly. So with that, maybe I'll stop share, because this is just a kind of, this is our window into, from Criterion's perspective, as we take these 5 strategies that I think have really held up over time, to say, how do we think about these 5 strategies and what is necessary for implementation? What are the angles on implementation that allow us to really organize efforts on this front? So I'll pause there, see if there are any questions emerging. I see there's an active chat. I'm not going to look at it. I'm just going to see, LD, if there's anything you want to call out.
And Joy, I've sent you a list of our questions. We have one from Victoria and one from Lauren. Yes, exactly. For Victoria, we said, are there any leaders, companies, or governments in developing and implementing policies/programs that address GBV in the workplace for supporting employees who are experiencing IPV in their homes?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and well, there is effort in that direction for sure. And I think this is really where COVID has presented a moment where I think out of Me Too, there was a large focus on sexual harassment in the workplace. Over the last 6 months, we've seen a significant expansion of that conversation, and we really think Futures Without Violence is one of many organizations can be leaders on this, of making sure that when we're looking at workplace policies, we're looking at workplace policies that also incorporate survivors. I think we've got a ways to go in how to make that practical. There isn't a product right now, but there are definitely people looking at it.
Great. And our second question is from Lauren. What was the decision-making process for Criterion to select its prioritized focus areas?
I'll actually think back on that slide. I had some actual logic. I don't know, I sort of feel like it's been hard. So one is the screens that were actually on this previous slide. I'll sort of go to those because in some ways it's what emerged, but one was, is there an opening to move things forward? Are there conditions? So our focus on infrastructure is not because infrastructure is low-hanging fruit, but because so much money is moving to infrastructure. The second is that it would be a compelling approach to make a difference on GBV, either because of the scale or the scope, right? And we wanted to make sure we were both going broad and sort of, you know, maybe lower impact, but broader scale and deeper impact, like, you know, the work we're doing with sort of folks in Kenya on supply chains where you can go much deeper. And so for us, it really was a portfolio approach to say, and this was really important early on because when, you know, 3 years ago when we started talking about this, people were like, I don't know, that doesn't happen where I work, and I'm going to dismiss it. And so part of our job was to create a portfolio, a sort of a method, a way to frame this that nobody could escape from, right? So our focus on political risk made it so that there was a, that it was ubiquitous. And so a lot of it has been about creating a diverse enough portfolio. And then finally, and this is why people like you are so important to us, is who are the institutional partners? Because we're never going to manage any money ever. And so we just always need the institutional partners, both in terms of expertise on gender-based violence and in finance, to help us move forward.